All right. So I am sitting in my dining room, video chatting with my friend Pollina in Chicago. And Pollina has agreed to have a conversation with me today about my 7 simple questions for women in the creative and the art world, just to get an idea of her experiences. So this is Pollina. Hi, Pollina.
Hi.
Isn't
Hi.
technology wonderful?
Yes. And I can hear you so clear.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, so let's start with some basics. What area of the arts are you in? What do you do now?
So I study history, but I also am doing my project, my dissertation, PhD dissertation on the Soviet children's literature. But in doing that, I'm also looking at the illustration for the Soviet children's books. So my major area of studies is like Soviet history and history in general, but I'm also really trying to situate myself in this area of like maybe art history because a lot of illustrations were actually done in the genre of socialist realist art.
Really? Okay. I think you were explaining that to me
Right.
one time before.
Yes.
That was interesting. That was interesting. Okay, so in case
Uh-huh.
anyone who's peeking and listening to this video didn't get, Polina has an accent because she's actually from
Yeah.
Russia. So it
Don't
makes sense that she would be studying Russian history, Russian art history, things like that. Okay, so that's what your area is, where you are right now. You're working on your doctorate,
Mhm.
your dissertation. That's amazing. That's pretty amazing. You're like a rock star. You're my aspiration
You
piece
are mine.
because I plan to get there at some point.
Yeah.
Um, so, okay, tell me a little bit more about how you got started. So, prior to working on your dissertation, prior to coming to this topic, what were you doing? How did you get into this area of the arts and your interest in art history? What brought you to where you are now?
So my first degree was in philosophy and religious studies, and I studied a lot of like topics related to religious history, but also I was always interested in the history of religious art, but I just never got a chance to study it properly. And then that was what my undergraduate was in Moscow. And then when I came here, I entered a master's program in Chicago in history. And there I made, again, I took just a wide variety of classes. Again, I didn't get a chance to concentrate on something specifically. But I did one class in, it was the Irish history class, but there I wrote a paper where I kind of was working in the genre of like art history, working with like representations of revolutionary ideas in art. And then I got into PhD program at the University of Illinois at Chicago here in 2015, where I'm now, and that's a history program, but I still am trying, I'm working on the juxtaposition of history of the childhood or history of literature, literary studies, but also art history and probably like history of childhood. So it's a lot of like juxtaposed areas
Mhm.
of history, and art history is like one of it.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay, so now I want you to think a little bit about now this is going to be interesting because you can give me a very interesting perspective. Think a little bit about your schooling, training in your area in Russia,
Mhm.
here in the United States also,
Mhm.
and give me an idea of what you would say your experience has been versus that of maybe your male counterparts, your colleagues, your fellow student classmates who are male. Do you think that there was a difference in
Mhm.
the experiences that you have had in the arts thus far, in academia thus far, versus your male counterparts, your male peers?
Well, yes, I do believe that there is a difference, just as there is a difference in any, person's perspective versus other person perspectives. But I also think there is a gender division in part related to the fact that women, at least in our modern, whatever, American or even Russian, even more so society, are still more so responsible for this kind of like domestic sphere, or like taking care of the family. I have a family, I have a husband and a daughter. And I really feel like women in any kind of arts or disciplines, still, even if they don't necessarily have to, not obligated, but they still feel responsible for taking care or creating this kind of proper family, and around that creating their kind of like womanhood.
Yes.
But it's also really hard to do it when you have a full-time job. You probably know that. I think all women who have full-time jobs know how hard it is to, you know, have this double burden, so to speak. In history, there is this notion of double burden. So when women in 20th century, in many countries, especially countries that were under communist influence, when they received access to jobs and like legislatively they became more free, the question of double burden started to play out, because yes, they were free and they were eligible to do a lot of works, but they were still kind of responsible in the societal view. They were still kind of seen as those who take care of children, for example, or those who maintain the families. So I still feel it, and every time I see people in academia, for example, who have families, not necessarily children, but maybe anyone who they take care of, or a house or a family, I feel like it's more responsibility for them, and it's really hard to balance it out. But also you are seen, you're perceived as a person who is less so able to do more things, just because you have these other responsibilities. And in part, it might be true, but it's also, I think, the perception that we have of women now, like men can do it all, but women, no, they can't.
Really interesting. Now, it's interesting to hear you say that, because you gave your perspective from your the majority of your life being in Russia, but I hear commonalities in the historical perspective to what we hear here in the United States. So I think it's interesting that two different cultures, but women are sharing that same perspective. Okay. So I wanted you to think a little bit about that difference in the past. Now, tell me a little bit about right now. Right now, do you feel that any gender differences in your work? I know you are teaching college courses, and you are working on your PhD. Do you today, right now, we talked about the past, but today, do you see a difference? Do you see a change?
I think for sure there is a change, especially like, let's say in my like in the field that I specialize in, history. There is this saying that history has always been written by like, I don't know, privileged white males, right? But now in the last, let's say, at least 60 years or 50 years of historical studies, it is more open for like another views, just like we see more women artists, or at least in art history we see more stories about women artists, right? So we see this perspective, like female perspective on the arts, or whatever, life, female narratives. I think it's getting much better, and I also think that it's less is expected from women in terms, again, of the domestic sphere, and this domestic responsibilities or family responsibilities are now much more, at least it's accepted that they should be shared with whatever partner a woman has, and that's okay, right? Or women, or even like the expectations that women have now. I think it changed from, oh, if you're a woman, you have to be a certain way, you have to kind of channel the certain beauty standards, the certain standards of like womanhood, and also
Mhm.
you need to have a family. Versus now, it's more of like you can be whoever you want. You can
Mhm.
or cannot have. If you don't want, you can stay single, or you can live with a partner, or you can have a family. That won't, any of these choices won't make you any less of a woman, but it
Right.
actually will only make you stronger in whatever way you want it. And I
Mhm.
think this kind of takes this burden away from women. And it's, I think what is good about the processes that are going on now, especially in the US, that women are allowed to be whoever they want to. Well, at least in the public discourse, right? We're not talking
Right.
about the
Right.
ideal picture.
Right.
Yes, in
Exactly.
the past, right now.
Now that's interesting. That is a very interesting thing to hear you say that. Tell me, do you think so this vision or this feel that you have that women have a little bit more liberties to
Mhm.
be who they want to be, is this something that you would say has popped up in your latter years since you've been living here in the United States? When you go back home to Russia to visit, do you feel that same change? Has that culture and our culture here in the United States, have they kind of moved um, simultaneously together towards that change in how women have a little bit more freedom and liberties to do and be who they want?
I think it's both. It can be, my answer can be both yes and no. So
Okay.
on the one hand, it's no, and the difference are really drastic, and no, the cultures are not the same. And
Hmm.
I'll tell you a little, like a short story, if I can. So when I go for my research trips, I need to leave my daughter with my husband here,
Hmm.
and she goes to school. He can go to work. We have an amazing after school program. So she's basically taken care of until my husband picks her up from school or brings her to school. So it is hard for him to be here alone, but it's just for a few weeks while I'm in Moscow working in archives. And so I heard this conversation of him and his best friend in Moscow when my husband went visiting Moscow this year, and he was telling his friend, like, yes, I was staying with our daughter for like 3.5 or 4 weeks alone, but that was okay. It was hard. She missed Pollina, but that was okay. I could do that. So my husband felt proud of the fact that he could, take that role of both parents on himself.
Hmm.
And his best friend, who is an amazing person and actually a smart guy, said something. It was a joke, but it was a joke along the line that, oh, do you now have breasts or something? So it was
Oh,
a very
wow.
sexy joke about the fact that my husband has become less of a male because he stayed in, took care of his daughter. And
Interesting.
that made me sad, but it also made me laugh, just because I thought people are still, like, I felt sad for that guy that he's still living in this paradigm where men and women are supposed to act certain way as in regards to their own children,
Right.
to kind of represent their gender. And this is bizarre, because I think it should not be this way, because
Right.
identities should be more fluid. But then, yes, because I think similar processes are going, like all this kind of new feminist writings,
Mhm.
also feminist perspectives. Also, a lot of, in terms of art now in Russia, a lot of exhibition of female artists are
Okay.
going on, and we now hear this Russian art history represented through both male and female
Okay.
eyes, and we can see this female agency there. So it's hard. It's like, I think it's both.
It's both. I can see that. I can see that. Okay, so now let's think a little bit. We talked about the past, we
Mhm.
talked about the present. Let's kind of move towards the future. Give me some personal plans for you. What are some of your plans for the future? Once you finish your doctorate and you will be Dr. Pollina and you will go forward with this degree.
We'll see. We'll see. Well, hopefully, ideally, to write my prospectus, then my dissertation, then defend it,
Mhm.
and if possible, if I have enough energy, and if I'm not 100-year-old by that time, right? Then write a book about that same topic. And then my ideal goal would be to shift more so towards an area of art history from like history, but still have this apparatus of a historian to work with art history, Russian art history, and specifically this genre of socialist realism that is seen somewhat less of a and not very well respected, precisely because it was a very ideological art. And I do agree that it's mostly about ideology and kind of brainwashing rather than the art. But it's interesting also to look at it through art, like to see what kind of artistic tropes did this architects and artists use who were working in that interwar period under Stalin government. So it's interesting. It should be interesting. But for now, it's just the dissertation defending it. If possible, I don't know. I always wanted to have more. Not always, actually, but recently, I thought that I want to have more children, but we'll see.
Yeah, go ahead. Have more for me. Have more for me. Do it.
Yes.
Okay, so thinking about your future, the dissertation, defending the dissertation, the book. I think the book is going to be very interesting because when you first told me about the idea of the children's books illustration as kind of like propaganda, I thought that was really interesting. Like, wow, they were putting these ideas in the minds of children very young and having them, grow up with these ideas. I thought that was really interesting. So thinking about your dissertation, well, we're not going to say when you're 100 because you'll be finished that pretty soon. That's going to happen. I'm claiming it. It will be happening pretty soon. The book. Do you think that you'll be doing anything different or specific to get your goals with the book completed by virtue of you being female? Do you foresee that process, that road, having obstacles that are specific to you being female?
I might sound banal, and if you want, you can just delete this. Because I'm just afraid to sound too like simplistic. But
no, don't worry about that.
I think for any woman who wants to have a child, right? It's a challenge physically, like pregnancy, getting pregnant, pregnancy, and then postpartum. It's different from any male's experience, no matter how much a male partner is involved in, having children or whatever, nurturing these children, because I think women specifically, we participate, like physically we participate in it much.
Yes, definitely.
For sure. And even like it's inevitably our hormones are involved, everything involved. So to me, I think it's mostly the physical challenge, because I also admit that I'm getting older, but the thing is that for men, getting older is a much it's a much stretched process, while from women,
right,
at least like physically, we really are given just a certain amount of time,
right,
when we are more so physically strong to
right.
Help our children grow or anything. So I think to me that would be the challenge in terms of just the book or the dissertation itself. I think the female perspective would actually be my strength, not the weaknesses. I don't think that's
okay.
an obstacle. The fact that I want to look at, how and why were women actually represented as women, as writers, literature, not so many of them, and why it was such a male dominant world in the Stalinist Russia. Just these questions, but I guess they could be answered by anyone. It's just that I really want to look at this specific perspective. I'm not sure if I'm really answering this question.
No, that was a great answer. No, trust me, that was a very insightful and thoughtful answer. I appreciate that kind of reflective, introspective thinking. And that's perfect. It's a perfect segue to my last question. So I want you to think about I've asked this question of other people that have
Mhm.
participated in this project with me. What would you tell your younger self? What recommendations would you give to other female art historians would give to me? You know, I am in the beginning phase of becoming an art historian. What would you give as recommendations to a colleague like myself or your younger self? What would you tell your younger self that your older, wiser, more experienced self has learned?
Today I wanted to write down all the answers. You sent me the list,
Hmm.
preliminary list of the answers, and I was writing them, even though I think I am answering them slightly differently. And that last question I thought about, and I just had so many, like, be this, be that, be daring, but also be cautious.
Right.
So it's always hard, right, when you think about like it retrospectively, and it's always hard to talk to you. It's like I'm often, when I talk to my mom, or sometimes when we have any kind of little conflicts, and I'm thinking that we have them just because we are so similar, but she's also 30 years older than me.
Hmm.
So it's like maybe me in 30 years old, in 30 years after today. But I guess it's the thing that if you work in any kind of discipline or art, especially art history, right? I think because you hear so many opinions, and
Hmm.
the thing that you need to walk the line between being really respectful of other scholars or artists' opinions and try to hear them, even if you don't like them. But then
Mm.
also, if you feel like your brain, your energy, your time is abused, and a person, even no matter how professional he or she is in
Mhm.
artists, for example, if you feel like the person really is no good, maybe have this right, give your allow yourself this right to disrespect his or her position, allow yourself to disagree, and
Mhm.
allow yourself to kind of, maybe not to be in conflict, but to just walk away and say, that's my vision and I respect your vision. Or
Mhm.
maybe not respect, but I'm not going to try to change you. And that's another thing. I think artists often, um, or people in scholarly disciplines, they often try to influence and change other people, which is fine, which is
Yeah.
what we want to do, right? We want to change the world and influence other people. But I think it's also fine to just live things as they are and do your own project. Kind of imagine your own project and invest your time and energy into your own
I can.
vision, right? Set up your own
Yeah.
boundaries
I
around
can
your
see that.
own.
I can see that. I can definitely see that. That's actually very good advice because the way the world works, there
Yes.
will definitely be people who don't agree with you and you don't agree with them. And I think you made a valid point. The goal is not always to have both of us agree,
Right.
but I can respectfully hear what you think
Mhm.
and I can respectfully decide I don't want to agree with what you think.
Exactly
But
right.
I think the key there is just respect. And when you don't feel respected, that's when you can make
That's,
your exit. I like that. I like that.
I also think, just one more thing that I see it, I'm also teaching history to
Mhm.
young people, undergraduates. So I often see one thing within in the undergraduates, and another thing in the graduate students. So undergrads tend to be too self-centered and thinking, oh, I have my own opinion, I don't want to listen to others, I'm
Mm.
just going to criticize. And that's what we, as educators, we usually tell them, look, you have to listen, you have to try to get other people's points and
Mhm.
arguments and try to see the world through their eyes in order to understand the complexity of it. But then what I see, another thing I see in the graduate students,
Mhm.
that they are in a way, like too obedient to the
Yes.
experts in their field. And I think especially if you're an artist and you see and more respected, not necessarily older, but more respected, more established artists, you
Mhm.
kind of like go to them and say, oh, you're
Right.
smart.
Yes.
But
Yes.
then I think any person who really wants to establish her or himself in the field should really walk the line in between these two kind of poles, right?
I think now that's a very good point. That's a very good point. I have to laugh when I hear you say that the undergrads are a little self-absorbed and
They are very often.
and they have their opinion, and
Great, I love their opinions, but
I'm
sometimes
very surprised to hear that the graduate students are a little more docile. That's surprising to me. That's surprising to me because it seems, I would think, that when you get to, beyond the bachelor's level, and you have, especially if you've had some work experience.
Mhm.
So if you've had some work experience post bachelor's and then you're entering into a grad program, I would think that you would, and maybe I'm just speaking personally because I
Mhm.
feel like part of what has made me successful thus
Mhm.
far,
Yeah,
good,
and I
is
told you that before, that I think that's really set up your success, that you have this work experience and confidence in yourself, right?
and I think that's what it is. I think I would have thought that grad students, because they do have the work experience, they have experienced success and they've experienced some challenges and
Mhm.
hopefully learned from those challenges, they can apply that going forward. So it does surprise me to hear you say that your grad students are the ones who are a little bit more docile. That's interesting. I would not
I also see that a lot of grad students have experience in other in work outside academia. A lot of people are coming from, I don't know, education background, any other. They might work in marketing or IT, and then they decide to pursue a degree in arts or history.
right.
And they come in and they see, maybe they read a book or two or three of a certain author, and they see them as almost like God,
Uh,
father figures. But you
yeah.
should really not go to that extreme. That's what
I get it. I get it. And I guess in a strange kind of way, I can almost somewhat relate to that
Mhm.
because, I'm coming into this new world. I'm calling it my I've told you about that. I call it my 2.0. This is my pushing the reset button and starting my career over. And I came into it with a lot of information, but now that I am formally, academically
Mhm.
preparing myself, sometimes I do get overwhelmed with the amount that
Yeah,
I'm
you feel like everybody else, they
yes,
are the experts, but not you. You
yes,
actually
exactly.
are. It's just
Exactly. I do at times feel a little overwhelmed that there's
Mhm.
so much to know. And it's almost like the more I learn, the more I realize how much more I need to learn and how much more there
Yeah.
is to do. So I guess I
But I guess it's a problem with getting older. I feel
is that what it is?
yes, yes, I think so.
Well, I'm a lot older than you, so I don't know.
Not a lot.
Well, Polina, I am so glad that you gave me some of your time this evening.
Thank you.
This was perfect. I enjoyed, as always, chatting with you about art, and I appreciate you more than you know that you participated in my
I
little
appreciate
project. So
you.
when you see this video on my website, you'll be excited because I'll be excited. All
Thank you
right,
so
talk
much
with
for
you
the
later.
interesting, for the really, really interesting questions.
Oh yeah, I thought so too. I was trying to make them kind of, introspective, kind of like,
Yes,
so yeah.
absolutely. Yes.
All right.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.